I'm pretty pleased to present our first speaker of the day. Her name is Mowery. She's going to be talking to us a little bit today about where and how we build land use planning strategies in the WUI. Molly serves as the executive director of the Community Wildfire Planning Center, and she is also the founder of Wildfire Planning International, which is a land use and wildfire mitigation planning consulting firm. Throughout her career, she has successfully launched and managed national wildfire programs, including the Fire Adapted Communities Program in partnership with the Forest Service and the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire Program. She has designed and delivered national trainings to educate land use planners and fire professionals, including the first Wildland Urban Interface Planning curriculum for the U.S. Fire Administration. She is a certified planner and has a BA degree from Naropa University and a master in city planning from MIT. Welcome, Molly. Thank you for being here to talk with us today. I will go ahead and turn over the floor to you.
Great, thanks, Ivy. Let me navigate quickly to my PowerPoint, and I'm going to rely on Annie to, once I put it into slide mode here, I'm gonna rely on Annie to make sure it looks good. Should I switch it or does it look good?
It looks fantastic.
Okay. Perfect, great. And I'm also going to rely on Annie or Ivy to give me a heads up if there's some questions, since I can't actually see the chat. So I have left time for discussion and Q&A with the whole group, like at the end of this. But if you have something that you want to clarify, just please, let Annie know or Ivy in the chat, and want to make sure that everything's clear. So yes, good morning. It's really great to meet you virtually and be here. I think many years ago, I want to say 7 years ago, I also had an opportunity to talk at a similar forum in Idaho in real life. So it's nice to be back here virtually. So I just wanted to start out as Ivy mentioned, I serve as the executive director for a nonprofit called the Community Wildfire Planning Center. And I was thinking about how our work fits into the larger fire adapted communities approach. And on the one hand, it's very straightforward. You see this fat graphic. And Annie, I don't know if this fat graphic even has a name, but I'm calling it the fat graphic, where we really fit in from a straightforward standpoint with regulations, policies, and plans. But as I look at the fat graphic more and I think about really all the work that we do, there's just this inherent interconnectivity because the wildland urban interface truly is so complex, as we all know. And there's so much relationship between discussions on the built and natural environment in the WUI and how really I don't feel like I can separate my work and the work that our organization does from so many other aspects of the fire adapted communities approach. I mean, in reality, I thought there was an argument where I could have put circles on all of these, but then I thought maybe that was getting a little bit too far ahead of myself. So, again, with the wildland urban interface, the WUI, we know it's complex in the sense that, my work takes me all over the country, and I see it as a very multidisciplinary collaborative approach. So whereas I'm a land use planner and I'll be talking about land use planning, it's very rare that I'm ever actually working on just planning related issues with communities. I'm working in parallel with or in collaboration with foresters, with fire professionals, with land managers, with elected officials. And we all have this approach towards really finding ways where we can make land use planning compatible with other approaches that are required to achieve fire adaptation. So I wanted to go through a little bit of what land use planning could look like for the WUI. It doesn't always play out this way, but what the different options are for when we're talking about land use planning in the WUI. So the first one is with site design and layout. So for example, when subdivisions are first being proposed, communities can determine where it might be appropriate to allow the subdivision in the first place. This is typically tied to a hazard map that would identify where the highest wildfire hazard areas are. And these maps are created either locally or at the state level. And I'll actually mention a few resources later of where some of these maps or how these maps play a role in the planning process. So more often though, on the one hand, I think the ideal approach is, can we look at where development could be directed away from these high hazard areas? But in reality, more often what we see is, what are the mitigation requirements that would be required through subdivision regulations to mitigate the wildfire threat? Another way that we can integrate land use decisions with wildfire mitigation is to ensure that subdivisions or other residential areas include appropriate access and water supply. And this is really for two reasons, two primary reasons. The first is to ensure that first responders and firefighters have the ability to safely respond to a fire, so they have the appropriate access and water supply. And it's also so that that supports a safe evacuation, particularly with access routes for the public. It's surprising to me how many communities I go to where emergency responders will tell us right away that they just can't get into some areas. They can't get up driveways. There's secondary emergency access routes that are ineffective, or they don't have water supply. I'm sure this may sound familiar to some of you. What frightens me is when I hear that it would take a minimum of an hour for a brush truck to get to a certain residential area. So I don't think this is a position that anyone wants to be in. So the question always comes up to me is, why are we allowing it, and what can we do to improve that? Mitigation through land use planning, this is really where we start talking about Firewise principles, is also can be done through vegetation management, landscaping. So I'm sure you've all heard the term defensible space, where we can look at how to modify the areas around a home. And in this case, land use decisions can really factor in by stating what type of plants may or may not be allowed in certain areas or required, and how they may be planted a certain distance in the home or around the home. And then larger vegetation management can occur at the neighborhood and community scales in terms of talking about whether it's development agreements or other maintenance of common open space and parks through through agreements that are established when a subdivision or another kind of residential area is being planned. And then, of course, mitigation can take the form of requiring ignition-resistant building materials and construction methods and techniques in these wildfire hazard areas. This is not just for homes, but I'm also referencing other structures like decks and fences, which we know are highly combustible. And then in terms of land use planning, I also like to point out that land use planning can also be a mechanism to discuss and address the actual land uses. So in this case, I'm referencing hazardous land uses. It doesn't mean that a sawmill is a hazard per se, but if the question comes up, whereas what would happen if this land use was put next to a forested area that had no mitigation? Is that the safest location, or should there be mitigation required, or certain distances from where these combustible materials will be stored? Combustible in this case meaning obviously if they're highly flammable. This is also a picture on the right-hand side from a picture from the town of Paradise, California, that I took after the campfire. And you can see, and if you had toured the area, there were many places, businesses, in this case it was a gas station, that were affected by the fire. So the question isn't, we can't have these uses. It's just more appropriate to ask, if we're going to have some types of uses like a propane tank farm, where would it be located, or what other mitigation should be required? And then there's vulnerable land uses. So the same is true here, where we ask, it's not a question of whether or not you should have them. It's just a question of, if we're talking about hospitals and care facilities and prisons or other uses that may require special evacuation considerations, where should these be located, and what other mitigation factors should we consider as part of the approval process for these uses? So there's many ways to think about how land use planning can support this larger approach to community fire adaptation, and where I think our role as planners fits into this process. And now I really want to talk more about the how. So how do we accomplish this? I know all of you are, not all of you, but I think I'm one of the only planners on the call. So I want to just talk about this more in terms of what the planning tools are that at a minimum would be helpful for you to be aware of and familiarize yourself with, and then how you can play a role in those discussions. So this really isn't reserved just for land use planners, but really encouraging you to think about ways to participate in these planning conversations. So the first set of plans that I wanted to cover, there's many plans, and probably many of you work on many other plans, but in terms of land use plans, this set of tools that I like to think about, the primary ones would be the comprehensive plan, the hazard mitigation plan, and then community wildfire protection plans. So for example, with a comprehensive plan, this may also be called depending on what state you're in, a general plan or a master plan or a growth policy if you're in Montana. It's really the foundational policy document for local governments. And communities use this plan to establish a long-term planning framework, maybe 20, 30 years, some are even longer if they're factoring in discussions like climate change, for example. And so traditionally, these plans focused more on the nuts and bolts of physical development. But contemporary plans have branched out more to include a wider range of economic and social and environmental topics, which could include resiliency, sustainability, and natural hazards. Communities interested in addressing the WUI can do this in different ways. Some of this is driven by what the state may require. So for example, California is a good example of where they have a very robust framework for saying, all these, so communities in California are required to have a general plan. Communities meaning municipalities and counties. And in the general plan, they have to address hazards. So there's no question. And not only do they have to address hazards, but specific to wildfire, there's a set of policies that they have to consider when they're updating their general plan. So in other words, it's a very robust approach to a wildfire planning framework that's driven by the state, and then local communities are required to meet that. These requirements are tied to, or policies, I should say, are tied to a statewide map. I mentioned earlier that typically a map will drive the process. So in my world, I see that if a state has a generally good map that they can use for showing where the WUI is or showing where wildfire hazard is, that is very helpful. It may not be a perfect map, it usually never is, but it's very helpful for driving a policy discussion because at least everyone can speak to that map. And then of course, maps can also be done at a local level and often are more effective when they are locally adopted in terms of reflecting what might be a more granular look at where the hazard is. I was surprised to learn recently, we did some research through our work. It was funded by the Hewlett Foundation. We did some research on 4 different states and what their approaches were to hazards and planning, specifically wildfire hazard. We looked at Colorado, Washington, Montana, and then California. And so where I live in Colorado, and I don't only work in Colorado, but I live here, and so I'm a little bit more familiar with the planning framework. I was still surprised when I realized that looking through the state statutes that here municipalities and counties have to adopt a master plan, but only municipalities are required to address the location of hazards, including wildfire and geological hazards or steep slopes and floods. Only municipalities have to address that through the planning process. So in other words, counties which I think of counties as having a lot of wildfire hazard. They're not really unique in that respect. Don't have to have a specific hazard chapter or even address hazards at all when they adopt a master plan. It doesn't mean that counties here don't do that, but it's just done on a voluntary basis depending on what the interest and will is at the local level. Similarly, in Washington state, I'm not sure if any of you are, I think some of you might be from Washington, but maybe not. We found that many jurisdictions are required to adopt comprehensive plans. This is based on the state's Growth Management Act, but hazard elements still remain optional, regardless of whether or not you have to have a plan. And again, that really surprised me. It's not to say you can't find good examples of local communities that have adopted in Washington a comprehensive plan that addresses hazard, but it's not a requirement. And so if you're interested in this topic, I know it's a little wonky, but if you're interested in this topic, you can definitely read more. I'll show our website at the end of this, but we have the full report on our website, and we profile in more detail the 4 states and some of the other findings from them. So the 2 other plans, just to touch on, and my guess is that many of you are familiar with these plans, are hazard mitigation plans and community wildfire protection plans. And I know Jerry's on the call, and he's spoken a lot in the past about how important it is to connect these 2 plans if communities have them both in place, and really looking at the hazard mitigation plan and the community wildfire protection plan as I don't know if I'd say partner plans, but complementary plans. So FEMA requires that state, tribal, local governments adopt hazard mitigation plans as a condition for receiving certain types of non-emergency disaster assistance, including funding for mitigation projects. And then CWPPs, of course, are focused specifically on wildfire. And while we know in many states they aren't binding, I see them as a really unique opportunity for those of us engaged in fire adaptation and community mitigation work to really use them as a vehicle for getting all the partners around the table for planning. And you can inject land use planning into these conversations. So a lot of the actions focus more on reducing structural ignitability. A lot of the CWPPs that I see also have opportunities to increase Firewise communities, for example. One of the things that I like to advocate for is how these CWPPs can really look at development strategies, development mitigation strategies, and link that back to the comprehensive plan. So ideally, when you think about these wildfire or hazard plans, think about how you can integrate land use concepts into them. If nothing else, how you can reference back to the comprehensive plan and look at where does our community want to grow? Is that growth tied in any way to where our hazards are? And likely it should be. And then what's the future land uses planned? And do we need to think about how those could be mitigated either through land use policies or other types of actions? So this is the ideal. It's not to say that all communities always sync these plans, but in my world, this is what I really like to see and encourage communities to think about with that integration. Now, one of the things that I always hear about is, I get this criticism a lot of, well, plans just sit on a shelf. And in some ways that can definitely be true, but I would argue that one of the benefits of the planning process, and I'm sure you've seen this in your own work, is that it is the process that, if it's done well, the process itself is a positive outcome. But then, of course, it is true that many of these plans, at least in some cases, they aren't legally binding. So this is really where regulations come into play. And in the world of WUI regulations, I think of these 5 types of regulations as really the most common ways that communities are regulating the WUI. So there's the building code, fire code, subdivision regulations, zoning and or land use development code, depending on how it's structured at the local level. And then there's the standalone WUI code, which it doesn't have to be standalone. This could also be incorporated into a chapter of a fire code or building code, or there's even, I've seen WUI codes, WUI chapters in zoning codes. So with building and fire and WUI codes, often these are modeled after either the International Code Council or the National Fire Protection Association's model codes or standards. It's very common. So for example, in 2018, the state of Washington adopted portions of the International Code Council, ICC's WUI code, to become part of their state building code. And that took effect very recently, February 1st, 2021. And this new statewide code includes requirements for ignition resistant construction for roof coverings, exterior walls and siding, accessory structures such as decks, and even minimum standards for driveways. The state of Washington has also adopted the International Fire Code, which is a separate in their Washington administrative code. And that's also effective in all counties and cities in the state. And that code does contain a chapter on the WUI, which supplements provisions in the state's building code. So while myself as a land use planner, I may not have a direct role in the fire code or the building code. For me, it's really important to know about them because this is where conflicts can occur, or could be overlap, or some, trying to understand what's regulated where can be a bit of a maze sometimes when you're looking at the state level and the local level. So for example, fire codes typically regulate firefighter access, such as road widths and road grades and water supply, and even sometimes there's limits on vegetation in some areas. And so subdivision regulations, which aren't completely separate, but they're often found in a very separate chapter of a county or a municipal code, they can also regulate access, road grades, water supply, number of entry points, etc., for residential areas. So subdivision regulations, though, in addition to that, can look at lot design, layout, also vegetation. A good example might be in the Missoula County, Montana code. They have subdivision regulations that includes a specific section on wildfire hazard area standards. And these regulations look at the design and development of subdivisions in wildfire hazard areas. They actually prohibit development of subdivisions in areas like ravines or other topographical features where the fire behavior may be particularly extreme. They have an assessment for their subdivision process. And then they also have a requirement for clearing vegetation within 100 feet of roads and maintaining specific types of water supplies. So it's not to say there's going to be a conflict between some of these codes. It's just important for communities to know that there are potentially a variety of codes and that similar requirements can be in different codes. And then finally, zoning and the land development codes may also impose other types of conditions tied to specific uses. Again, going back to those different types of land uses, or zoning districts. So we all live in different zoning districts. It might be a residential zoning district, a commercial, mixed use, and they all have different requirements. And so some jurisdictions, like one example would be Summit County, Colorado, they require that any rezoning in any district, any rezoning application will be subject to wildfire hazard. So in other words, if you come in and say, I have a commercial property and I want to change it to a residential property, that will facilitate a process that says, okay, we're going to look at your wildfire hazard and see if we need to address anything. So the same can be true where some communities may impose certain standards, whether it's in a fire overlay zone or some other type of zone where they say, we think that in this zone, you have to have a property setback of X number of feet because we want to ensure that you're away from your neighbor by more than just 10 feet. So there's certain zoning districts that require certain conditions, or I should say standards, on the way that development occurs. It could even be as detailed as you are restricted to have, and we've seen this, your firewood storage in a certain area, or you have to move your wood pile away. Again, Summit County has a requirement in their land use code that says during a certain time of year, I think it's May to November, you cannot have firewood within 30 feet of your house. So that gives you a sort of a flavor of the various ways that communities are approaching this. What I see most often is a combination of all of these approaches. So I'll use LA County as an example. LA County has a building code, a fire code, a subdivision code, a zoning code for a certain area. And these are all of these codes are regulating certain aspects of wildfire in certain areas. And so they also have a general plan and a hazard mitigation plan and many, many other plans. And so a lot of my work is actually working with communities to help them understand what do they have in place and how does it fit together and what should they be doing if they want to strengthen some of these approaches. So it's really getting fire officials and planners to the table, and then other practitioners, and sometimes, like I said before, elected officials. Really, a lot of our work is getting people around the table to talk about what they want to do to address their development and reduce risk to it, and then how they can look at their current codes and regulations and plans today and how they could improve them in the future. A very much deeper dive into the specific types of tools to be aware of, or if you want to look at more examples. A few years ago, I co-authored this publication. It was for the American Planning Association, but it was also funded by the Forest Service. And so it's a free publication to anyone. You can go to this website, our communitywildfire.org website, and under resources, you'll see this, and then you can get the link. It's a little bit clunky to get the actual publication. It's free, but you have to go through a couple steps of signing up. So if you have trouble, if you really want this publication, just email me and I'd be happy to directly send it to you. So that's just if you want to take a closer look at this. So one of the things that really has, maybe it shouldn't come as a surprise, but it has come as a surprise to me, is in doing all this research on the WUI, and quite frankly, over the last, I would say 5 years of my career, there's been a lot more interest in land use planning. How can land use planning be part of this process, which is totally exciting for me. I love that, the New York Times will call me up and say, how can land use planning play a role in all these bad wildfires? But the irony is that in a lot of my work and a lot of my research, I've found that these aren't really new concepts at all. And so when I first started working for the NFPA more than a decade ago, one time one of the, she was sort of served as a librarian role and worked in the archives office, and she came and she said, Molly, I think you'd find this publication really interesting. And it was this early version of technical guidance that was prepared by the NFPA Forest Committee. And I think, I can't even see the date on it here, I think it's 1935. So for the whopping price of 10 cents, they had issued this guidance on how to protect summer homes and forested areas. This was really geared more towards not the Western US, but areas like in the Midwest, like let's say upper Minnesota, where there were a lot of cabins, and there were cabins that were burning, and they wanted to issue guidance. And surprisingly, a lot of the guidance is not that different from today, or maybe it shouldn't be surprising because it's the same principles of how structures burn. But the guidance talked about the construction of buildings, how to care for both fire indoors when you're burning in the fireplace, and also outdoors, how to store, where to store your combustibles and flammables, and how to maintain sweeping away pine needles from indoor and outdoor areas, and things like that. And then also, when I was working on the research that we did for the APA, American Planning Association publication that I just referenced a few slides ago, I was looking at the early days of where the WUI fires really started occurring. And I talked to Steve Pine and remember asking him, what was really the first WUI fire in your mind? And I don't think he had a specific answer, but he did point me to the Bel Air Brentwood fire, which some of you may be familiar with, that occurred in California in 1961. And this became famous because it was a high-profile celebrity, considered a celebrity fire in LA. So this is one of the more famous pictures from this time when President Nixon was using his garden hose to wet down the wood shingled roof of his rental house in one of the neighborhoods. But on a more serious note, one of the things I found when I was looking at this fire was a fascinating video that was issued by LA Fire Department, and it talked about after the Bel Air Brentwood fire, what the reasons were for why it was such a disaster, and how the relationship of topography and development, and then burning firebrands played a significant role in how these homes, how areas were designed, and why these homes were lost to fire. And it mentioned in the video, which was even a wilder tidbit to me, it mentioned in the video that experts from the National Fire Protection Association had come early on, I think in the 1950s, prior to this fire, and had toured the area and came up with a list of recommendations to assess the community design, and they called it a design for disaster. So I thought, oh, this was back in the 50s and we were talking about this. And then it was in the 70s when I could find the first formal reference to the term wildland-urban interface. It was actually, I think it was the urban wildland interface is how the term started, but it was a physicist at the Stanford Research Institute who used the term to describe a situation related to urban development and wildfires. So he said, in its simplest terms, the fire interface is any point where the fuel feeding a wildfire changes from natural, i.e. wildland fuel, to man-made fuel. And for this to happen, wildland fire must be close enough for its flying brands or flames to contact the flammable parts of the structure. So quite honestly, I still think of the WUI, and we still talk about the WUI in very similar terms today. I know for some of you, it might be more oriented towards a geographic location, but really, I think it's telling that this was, in the first times that we were talking about it, it really was the set of conditions. And, still in our work, we talk about these set of conditions as being what makes the WUI so dynamic and vulnerable. Also in 1981, just for another tour back into time, the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Forest and Range Experiment Station, which was based in Berkeley, California. Maybe it still is based there, but I know it was based there at the time. They issued this publication that was written by Howard Moore, who had served as the Deputy State Forester for CAL FIRE. Well, it was back then the California Department of Forestry. Anyway, this publication goes into a number of solutions. Many of them relate to land use planning. So for example, one of the recommendations that this publication made was to require all cities and counties having any areas of undeveloped wildlands within their boundaries to review their ordinances on planning, land use, building, and fire for the purpose of making them truly effective in reducing the danger of destruction of residences and other structures by wildland fire. So again, it's fascinating to me that we've had this guidance. More recently, in the early 2000s and late 90s, we started seeing additional publications, which you may be more familiar with. They look similar to what we have today in terms of resources, but truly it's revealing to me that we've learned more, certainly, about ignitions, but we've had decades of guidance related to development in the WUI. And so the question, of course, is, well, what's happening with the WUI? How are we applying land use planning today? And then what could we be doing better or more of? And so I think this map is equally revealing as in terms of WUI growth over the past decades. You may have seen this. It was produced by the Silvis Lab and the University of Wisconsin-Madison Silvis Lab and the U.S. Forest Service. And so it may be a little bit difficult to see, but over the span of these 2 decades, we starting in 1990 and then 2000 and then 2010. Their analysis shows that the WUI grew, where we added 13 million homes between this 20-year period and expanded the WUI area. So these homes were spread out. We expanded that area by 33%. This is probably a more revealing map that many, showing how many Western counties have experienced the highest growth rates of homes. This darkest shade is where there was more than 75% increase in the WUI in homes. I think you can see Boise looks like to me, Boise is one of the darker shades as well, which probably comes as no surprise. And this growth has, it's starting to have a lot of consequences, particularly in the last five or plus years. So an analysis showed the same analysis on WUI growth showed that meanwhile, while we're growing, we're also rebuilding in areas that have had fire. This is an example from the Tubbs fire in 2017, which burned in an area in California that in a neighborhood that had previous fires. We added over 100,000 homes to these areas that had already burned, and they were in known fire perimeters between, that same time period of 1990 to 2010. And then perhaps more sobering is that a more recent analysis by Headwaters Economics showed that between 2005 and 2020, we've lost more than 89,000 structures to wildfire. In 2020 alone, which wasn't the worst in the past 5 years, but it was just very current, wildfires burned and damaged almost 18,000 structures. And this made it one of the most destructive fires on record, or seasons on record. We know, of course, one of the things that I would say concerns me the most right now in my work is what the influences of climate change are likely to do in terms of the effects on development and the relationship between the built and the natural worlds. We've been hearing more and more about the mega drought that's in the US, which is a long-running drought, something that scientists are saying is only occurring I've heard anywhere between 500 years and 1,200 years, but regardless, we know we're in a drought. And we haven't really, we're starting to see how that may play out in terms of whether or not places are going to experience aridification. It's definitely not my area of expertise, but I'm trying to stay abreast of the science enough to really see how these decisions are going to affect or should play a role in our development and our growth across the West. We also know that, as the WUI continues to grow, it's raising a lot of questions on where land use policy trade-offs are going to occur. So for example, another challenge that we see is that if we only look through the lens of wildfire, it could be very easy to just say, well, let's not have new housing anywhere in these areas because it would make life a lot easier from a wildfire standpoint. We wouldn't have as many losses. But then the reality is that, there's a lot of people that need to live somewhere. We are continuing to grow, and all of these Western states that we've been looking at, growth is occurring, and affordable housing is also an issue. So that's where I think that the policy challenges come into play, is where we can try and reconcile how to safely grow in certain areas that are not, that are wildfire prone. Can we mitigate enough to justify putting people into these areas while still meeting other needs that communities are having, such as increasing housing and affordability for people so they can live somewhere? So I would argue that we need a combination of strategies. We know land use planning is also not enough on its own. So we have to start looking at solutions that can work for wildfire, but will also factor in, or it can be integrated alongside other planning solutions. In the research that we did, that I mentioned earlier, we came up with 5 solutions that I thought I'd just end on. And then I also wanted to, I think if Jerry's still not on the beach yet in his Hawaii vacation, he could share a little bit of insight in what the city of Boise has been doing, because I think it's also a neat little example. I shouldn't say little, but a neat example of, and a local example of how the city has been looking at WUI regulations. So anyway, just to go through these solutions, one of the things that we suggest in our report is to adopt state legislation for minimum wildfire hazard planning requirements. So this planning legislation we talked about earlier can really drive forward the process to, prompt communities to include wildfire hazard and other hazards in their planning process. In other words, I'm thinking of a good adjective to use besides surprising. It's surprising and perhaps disappointing to me that, we still don't have, if we're going to have comprehensive plans, which are important for community growth and, creating visions for communities for their development, that we don't automatically factor in hazards. So state planning legislation could go a long way in really moving that process forward. The second solution that we suggest is to integrate the role of land use planning expertise in WUI initiatives. So another major observation that I had when I was writing this report was just how often state governments delegate WUI planning responsibilities to departments that are specialized in natural resources and wildfire response. And this is very much a good thing in the sense that we always need this integration of disciplines. However, it not just felt, but it was an observation that I made that, where these natural resource departments and wildfire response departments are very well versed in undertaking wildfire hazard and risk assessments and outreach and education, the reality is they're not land use planners, and nor would we expect them to be. And so there's a bit of a gap in how land use planners are even participating in these conversations, and where I think we could be invited more to come to the table and talk through, if the state wants to adopt a WUI code, I would hope that planners are involved in that process, but we don't always see that happening. And when we don't see that happening, then we see a disconnect and we wonder, why isn't anyone adopting the WUI code at the local level? It's typically because the planners don't even know it exists as an option. So truly at the state level, bridging these different agencies and areas of expertise, I think would help improve land use planning outcomes in the WUI at the local government level. And then similarly, or somewhat related to that, we of course suggest promoting learning opportunities to engage planners on WUI topics. I know the state of Washington is undertaking the development of some land use planner trainings, which is exciting. Our organization is really excited to be working with CAL FIRE to also create some land use planner trainings for planners in California, and Colorado has also developed a toolbox of different planning topics and tools for all hazards, including wildfire here in Colorado. So definitely we see these resources being developed, and I just think it's always a good solution though to continue to encourage them. Then of course, I wanted to acknowledge that we have a large existing WUI, so a lot of these tools are geared towards the future. What does future development look like? And I wanted to acknowledge that we also need programs like retrofit, home hardening, voluntary programs. Firewise is a great fit here too. How we can reach out to existing communities that can't easily rebuild themselves, but have to think about ways to mitigate where and how they can. And then finally, identifying and transferring land use planning best practices from other hazards, I think is a ripe opportunity. We often don't see enough cross-pollination from other hazards. Not everything will be appropriate, of course, but we do suggest a few ways and opportunities in our report to look at this. So the key takeaways in my mind, are WUI planning requires a multidisciplinary approach. That there are many plans and regulations we can use to address wildfire. So there's certainly no shortage of opportunities. And we know that land use planning as a strategy for the WUI is not new, but I would argue that the urgency to apply solutions is definitely increasing. So I highlighted a few of these. I would, if you're interested in this topic or want to learn more, go back to anything that I was talking about and do a deeper dive. I think these would be my top 2 resources I'd suggest for planning, learning more about planning and its connection to the WUI. And you can also get in touch with me. I won't be able to participate in much of the rest of this forum, but you can definitely email me at molly@communitywildfire.org.